Psych Sessions podcast is brought to you by Macmillan Learning Psychology. At Macmillan Learning Psychology, they know content matters, but only if it truly reflects contemporary psychology and how students experience it. Instructors have loved their Psychology Speaker series for just that reason, with topics ranging from engaging students online to diversity in the classroom to the mental health impact of COVID. Their speakers cover the topics you and your students care about. Macmillan Learning Psychology, because content matters, but only when you connect it to students' lives. If you missed our most recent speaker, Tony Schmader, and her talk on implicit bias, or want to see it again, you can watch a recording of it at macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions.
Hello, and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 122, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Kelley Haynes-Mendez from the American Psychological Association in Washington, D.C. Before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and some of my favorite moments. Now, this is a little bit of a time travel episode, and what I mean by that is that when Kelley and Garth actually had this chat for this episode, Kelley was indeed not employed at the time by APA in Washington, D.C., but she was still an associate professor of psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And that's going to be the center of the conversation that you're about to enjoy. However, since the time, and since I'd like to be as accurate as possible, let me share with you that Kelley has changed jobs, and she is now currently the director of the Ethnicity, Race, and Cultural Affairs portfolio at APA. And so you won't hear them talk about that during this interview because that actually hadn't happened yet, and that's the time travel part. But I am extremely confident that you're going to thoroughly enjoy this interview because Kelley shares a bit of her background, her growing up, and her expertise and her passions both professionally and personally as well. And I really enjoyed getting to know Kelley a little bit better. I knew of her work through STP and on the executive committee, although our terms of service never overlapped through STP. She starts off really with a very nice primer about PsyD programs and what it means to attend a professional psychology program. Not only did she attend a PsyD program for her doctoral work, but then she becomes a faculty member at Argosy University at first and then the Chicago School later on. And so that's the bulk of her teaching experience, post-PsyD, post-doctorate. And her teaching experience and expertise develops in teaching courses that help students explore diversity, treatment of diverse populations, and then it becomes an expert in teaching surrounding gender and international issues. And so I really appreciated Kelley's perspectives when she and Garth are discussing those topics in those courses. You can tell that Kelley's so thoughtful about these issues when Garth asks her about what was the most difficult thing about the COVID, the pandemic, the summer of George Floyd. Kelley steps back and says, well, I want to tell you two different things. I want to tell you about the perceptions, what I see from my students' perspective, and let me tell you about my own perspectives, kind of talking about a faculty perspective. And so I really enjoyed that. I'm not going to summarize it for you, but I want you to listen for that because I think you'll appreciate that thoughtfulness, that deep thinking that Kelley exhibits throughout this entire interview. I also really appreciated that she shared a lot about her childhood, growing up in rural Southeast Texas and Holly Springs, and how that place has a place of meaning for her historically and the historic events that happened there, and growing up quite honestly, with racism that grew up in her childhood and how that affected, her worldview and probably affected what she came to study in her professional life. She described, I believe in her words, and I think I'm going to use my words, really in some ways an idyllic childhood, growing up around family and lakes and barbecues and picnics. And I loved her description of, on her mother's side, the number of cousins that were on her mother's side alone, 60. That is 60. I'm trying to articulate 60. And so what a lovely environment to grow up around cousins and aunts and uncles and in that environment. I just really enjoyed what she shared about that and going to college and those experiences, and someone who I think kind of baked into her DNA, wanted to see the world and wanted to experience and enjoy diversity in all its forms, and just enjoys it, values it. And again, I can't come up with a better term other than baked into her DNA. Garth and Kelley talk about skills that can be life-wide and how diversity fits into that, and how you can sell this importance to students and faculty members and others throughout the community, especially the academic community. And so I appreciated that. Of course, they talked about STP a bit and how Kelley got lured into STP, and it was through a best practices in about the teaching of diversity. And so I appreciated that story, as well as the story about Kelley's work on the task force that created STP's statement on addressing systemic racism and inequity, and how Kelley was a member of the first stage, the 4-member task force that generated the first draft of that statement, and how they showed it to a trusted group of individuals, and how when they got feedback about that, they were told it was not up to snuff. And you can imagine this group of members of the executive committee, essentially getting a revise and resubmit, and I'm just so impressed that rather than get uppity or discouraged or insulted, they took it, I'm going to think, as a badge of honor and say, well, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's do this better. Let's dig into the literature. Let's look outside of psychology. And what a tribute to our current leaders in STP, the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, to take this feedback and run with the ball and really come up with a strong, powerful statement. And some of that credit that Kelley gives is to a sociologist, Victor Ray. And in the show notes to this episode, I'll provide some links to some of Victor's work if you want to read the original stuff. So anyway, you're going to really enjoy this. And I know there's a little bit of time travel here. So even though this wasn't known when this episode was recorded, let me share with you that Kelley Haynes-Mendez is going to be a recipient of an STP presidential citation in 2021. And so if you're going to be in Nashville in October, you will see President Susan Nolan present that to Kelley Haynes-Mendez. So please enjoy this episode.
I am so excited today to be able to sit down with Kelley Haynes-Mendez. Now, I'm going to try to get this right. Associate Professor of Psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. How'd I do?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, hey, welcome. We've been emailing back and forth. It seems like for the better part of the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm really glad we finally figured this out. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to make a long-term plan during the pandemic because things are fluctuating so much.
No kidding. And now you teach, when I go to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology website, does that organization have multiple campuses?
Yes. Okay. We have flagship campus in Chicago. We also have campuses across the country: Washington, D.C., Southern California, and also Dallas, Texas, and also an online campus.
Okay. And then beside your name, it said campus and it said online campus. So that's where you live.
Yes. I actually live in Dallas, and my program operates out of the online campus.
Okay. So does the online campus, do you and your colleagues exist kind of all over the United States, or?
Yes, from California to Chicago area to Texas, all of us.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm going to have a bunch of questions about that for sure. Now, I did my graduate work in counseling psych, and it was in Fresno, California. And my first internship was at an outpatient treatment center, and they took a lot of interns on, and it was shared by Alliant International University and the California School of Professional Psychology. Is the California School at all associated with the Chicago School?
No, it's not. They are separate institutions, but it's funny you ask, because I'm a graduate of the California School of Professional Psychology. So I am a born and bred professional school of psychology graduate and professor, primarily at schools of professional psychology.
And you just thought, I just want to change the where and keep everything else the same. It'll be easier that way. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about, it's funny, I did internships alongside some interns from the California School of Professional Psychology. But I don't know if I understand how that institution kind of differs from other, places where you'd go ahead and get graduate work done in psychology. Do you have a sense of that for me? Yeah. Right.
Sure. I think that programs of professional psychology are designed to train practitioners in a variety of interventions, primarily evidence-based, but with a focus on practicing within a clinical environment, or in many cases within a community environment, and with specific populations. So child, family, individual, adolescent. You'll find schools of professional psychology really focusing on specific types of interventions, or with specific populations, or building a skill set to work within communities or at a sort of structural level, rather than only working individual one-on-one in the office setting. So I think, though, that many programs are, PsyD programs, which I think is designed to do just that type of work. But many schools of professional psychology also have PhD programs. Folks are graduating out of those programs and doing research and teaching as well around usually clinical types of practitioner issues. I think that for me, what happened, I went into graduate school thinking I wanted to be a child psychologist. And I got into my first practicum placement, and they put me in a child play therapy group. And I said, oh, this is not what I was
wrong
professionally. So I was very fortunate at the California School of Professional Psychology. There was a specialization in multicultural and community psychology. And so I became exposed to multicultural psychology and a number of experts in that area as a part of my graduate training. So that really sort of transformed and shaped my approach to multicultural psychology and really developed my interest in that area as well.
Well, I definitely want to talk about that, because I know that you've moved into, I'm sure in other places as well, but I know you primarily from your role at STP right now, which seems to be related to that. At least I imagine it is in some ways. All those skills that you've developed in your academic career and then in your professional career have probably led to that. So anyway, I'd like to get there eventually. But did you say that when you started in the child psych program, that was also at the California school, but you just switched programs?
Yes. Actually, I didn't switch programs. I remember having a focus on adolescent psychology versus younger child development, and having a focus in adolescent psychology, family, and couples. And because the institution also had a focus in multicultural issues, I was able to take a majority of my concentration courses and electives in multicultural issues, and again, be exposed, I think, to faculty who held expertise in that area, whether they were teaching family psychology or whether they were teaching multicultural psychology specifically. My faculty really held expertise in the area of multicultural issues, regardless of whether it was social psychology or another topic. The focus was very often incorporating multicultural and diversity issues within the context of those courses. So for instance, my history and systems course, which was a required course, was really taught from a perspective of multiculturalism, diversity, social justice types of issues within the context of that particular course.
Right. Okay. I promise we'll move on from your professionals, the California School of Professional Psychology, but I still do have a couple of questions. And one is, now, did you do? See, I did a marriage and I was doing internships with all these people, but I was a marriage and family therapist, and then I was doing these internships, and there were PsyDs and there were PhDs or students who were enrolled in PsyD program and PhD program. Did you come out of the PsyD program or
Yes.
Okay.
The PsyD program.
Right. So can you help me? Because I have trouble articulating this even to students who are kind of thinking about it. How do you explain this, the difference between a PsyD and a PhD to students?
PsyD programs are, I would say, practitioner oriented. So you will have more course content and practicum and internship hours in a PsyD program versus a PhD program. In my experience and understanding of those differences, I also believe that PhD programs are focused around and probably have more content on conducting research, which also can prepare students for teaching profession. In my experience, has been very interesting as a clinician and also as a teacher of fellow clinicians, that I have also entered the teaching profession, but I have taught primarily people who were going to become practitioners, versus a PhD graduate might be teaching in different types of psychology programs. So undergraduate courses or departments, and or graduate programs that are also preparing students for a profession in research and teaching and the study of psychology.
So thanks for clarifying that. That's helpful. But it made me think about, just so that we can get an idea, who are your students right now? These students that you teach every day, and then, like, I guess everything. What is your load like? Who are the students? Because I don't think we've ever interviewed someone from a professional psychology school before. So, yeah.
So I'll talk about maybe the students I teach currently and students I've taught in the past. So currently I teach in a master's level program. Our students are from a variety of disciplines and have an interest in pursuing graduate school and also learning about general ideas related to psychology. So it's a foundational program that is graduate level. Historically, the majority of my experiences have been in other PsyD programs, so preparing people to graduate as clinicians. And in those programs, I think I've taught primarily around helping students become competent in multicultural and other types of diversity issues. So competencies around providing services to underrepresented and marginalized communities, both in terms of identifying one's own bias and awareness of those types of issues, just general knowledge about different cultural groups and what are relevant concerns, I think, to diverse communities, and then developing a skill set to put those ideas into practice. And so either teaching the specific diversity courses, I've taught courses in, exploring diversity, which is mostly about exploring one's own identity and sort of cultural formulation, intersectionality for oneself. And then, treatment of diverse populations, which is more focused outward in understanding cultural differences and what are the sort of professional practices that those communities respond best to. And then teaching more specifically about gender or international types of issues. So it's been a long time. I've been teaching full time for 18 years. And so I've taught a variety of courses and in a variety of programs, but I think my focus as a professor has really been to encourage cultural humility and cultural awareness for graduate students in psychology for the most part.
Right. And do you supervise students as well? Like now that you're in this master's program, are there students who are doing internships and you're supervising them as well?
Right. So formerly in the teaching in the PsyD program, yes, we had practica courses and faculty supervised and taught the practicum course. In my current program, it is not clinical. It does not lead to a practitioner-oriented career. And so presently, my work is mostly in the teaching of diversity and psychology.
Okay. Now, is that something that they were seeking out and you were able to, with your skill set, fill, or did it grow kind of the other way around where you had this expertise and they thought, well, we'd like to tailor this to what you're doing, like what you do so well?
I think a little bit of both. When I applied to the Chicago school, they were looking for a core departmental faculty member to teach a variety of courses. And when I came on board, I selected to do curriculum development and course content around primarily the diversity courses. We, at the time, had a concentration in cross-cultural psychology, and I taught primarily in that concentration. And so a lot of my courses were just focused on students who were later in the program and also wanting to develop more understanding and skills in and around sociocultural issues. And because of my interest, I think, and my skill set and experience in multicultural and diversity issues, more opportunities became available to me. We have at the Chicago School, the center, at the online campus specifically, the Center for Multicultural and Diversity Studies. And there is a faculty fellowship that is attached to the center. And I became the faculty fellow for the center, which means that I get to do a number of initiatives and projects related to multicultural and diversity studies at the online campus, which serves our faculty, our department chairs, and leaders at the campus.
You know what I'm thinking about, like as you think about your current work, and well, let me just cut to the chase. This last year has been an insane year, not only because of the pandemic, but we also had an election that brought up all kinds of things around equity and diversity and racism. And anyway, as you're watching all this, well, maybe I'll ask you this: how did teaching these kinds of things, and you've been doing it for a long time, was it at all different this last year than it had been in previous years? What is it like when these issues are so much at the forefront of people's minds? What's it like to go into your online classroom and tackle this stuff?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question from the perspective of students, and then also as a faculty member who is also a woman of color. So I think that in terms of students, the last year has been incredibly difficult due to COVID. Students are at home with their families. They have children who are also doing virtual learning while they're trying to, in my case, my students are usually adult learners who may also be working. They have families. And so it's been just a tremendous amount of additional responsibility for my particular student population. And so trying to be flexible, I think, with students this past year has really been important, and working with students to find solutions when they aren't able to sort of meet the demands for the week. I think that in terms of the diversity piece, and particularly around the political issues, it was interesting. I did have an experience in my diversity and psychology class in the fall where a student had refused to participate in the course because they were afraid that their position would create animosity and resistance. And my conversation with the student really was around having them lean into understanding the perspective of other students in the class versus getting across their own ideas or opinions, and really understanding another student's perspective versus pushing forth their ideas that might go against what we were addressing in class. And from that point on in the class, this particular student, I think, took that to heart, and we were able to sort of stumble our way through to the end of the course successfully. And then I think secondarily, just as a faculty person of color, I am originally from rural Southeast Texas. I grew up in a small community called Holly Springs, which is on the county line between Newton County and Jasper County. I went to Newton High School and did all of my schooling there, but Jasper County in 1998 became notorious for the dragging death of James Byrd. So James Byrd was murdered less than 5 miles from my home. So I spent a lot of time at my home over the summer because of COVID. So I have, more childcare in my hometown with my mother and other family members around. So we've been spending a lot of time there. And I think that being in that environment where, a little more than 20 years ago, a Black man was murdered by white supremacists, to be sitting in that space, having conversations about the George Floyd murder was very profound. It was a very profound experience for me, I think, as a professional, as a faculty member, and also as a Black woman with ties to this space that has, a racist history and all these types of experiences. And so balancing that, I think we talk a lot about rest and rejuvenation and self-care. And I think that as people of color, it's important for us to really embrace that and to have support and other faculty members who are available to have conversations with. I know at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, we have an affinity group for underrepresented women at the institution, both faculty and staff. And that was just a life-saving group for me during that time. Because, as a faculty member and someone who holds expertise in diversity and multicultural issues, the summer of 2020 was very busy. Everyone needed a diversity something.
Yeah. Well, and you have, I'm just listening to you talk and I'm like, you have this online expertise, which was required right now. Everybody was scrambling. And then also this multicultural diversity expertise. And so, were people reaching out at this point to you? What was that like?
A lot. It was a lot.
Yeah.
and I really had to make a decision at that point because COVID is happening. Everyone is exhausted.
Yep.
And then I've been teaching diversity and advocating for diversity in psychology for almost 20 years. And so now I have this moment, right, to push through every dream and desire I've ever had for the past almost 20 years. And so, or I could take a step back. And I think I really respect the people who did take a step back to say, I just can't do this right now. I have kids at home. I am trying to teach my courses. And now you want me to be your diversity expert. I cannot do it. But I think in my case, and again, because I had a support system in place, I was able to really lean into that period of time and get a lot of things done. So I made a lot of recommendations for new initiatives. STP, we worked on the STP statement on addressing systemic racism. And so there are a lot of opportunities to do that type of work, summer 2020 through the fall. And I was happy to do it. It was a lot in the moment, but I was happy to be a part of something that I had hoped for so long.
When those doors opened, because I suspect you've wanted some of these doors to open for a long time, but they weren't.
Right.
And then when these doors open, do you know exactly what those next steps are? How hard do you have to think about next steps for organizations or for faculty policies or whatever it is? Is that hard for you? Like if obviously I don't have your background. So if somebody said, okay, Garth, what should we do in this situation? I'd say, well, I'm going to call Kelley because I have no idea, but I'm wondering with your experience, was it pretty apparent? Like you knew the things that you wanted to get done?
Right. I'm very grateful to young activists who clarified the issues in the moment. So Black Lives Matter movement leaders and activists and advocates really helped us understand that systemic and structural inequities were the issue that needed to be addressed. And so with that clarification, I think it was easy to say your organization, your institution, your department very likely needs to look at one, the ways in which your policies or structures are inherently racialized or racist. And secondly, what are you going to do about it? So it was easy in the sense that the issue was very well clarified from the beginning. We're looking at systemic inequities and structural issues. And beyond that, sort of figuring out for your organization, what are those issues? And secondarily, how will you address those particular things?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when those leaders start speaking to these things, you're quickly identifying them as, and you hear that message loud and clear. You're familiar with it, and now you have ideas for next steps to proceed at that point. And by the way, I want to kind of just save the STP stuff, but I really do want to talk about that statement on addressing systemic racism that you all put together, because I thought it was a really wonderful step for our organization. So, yeah. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more about Holly Springs, Texas, and where you grew up.
Sure.
I haven't been to that area, but give us a sense of like, what was that like? And, we know some news that obviously you talked about that kind of came out of that area. Is that representative? Not murder, maybe every, I'm just going to let you take it. So Holly Springs, Texas.
Yeah. So I had a very idyllic childhood. So we are considered, rural people, very close to the land. My parents were sort of gardeners, and we had fresh produce. Summers were spent with cousins and going to nearby lakes and having barbecues and picnics. And it was just a really fantastic time and place to be a child and to sort of grow up in that environment. My mother's family actually is quite large. I had 60 first cousins.
How many?
On 60.
All right.
Yes. On my mother's side of the family. And on my father's side of the family, I don't know the exact number, it was about half that. And we saw each other almost every day. We went to the same middle school, elementary, high school, and we really grew up with our classmates. So our classmates, we had the same classmates from kindergarten all the way through senior year of high school. So you really grow up with the people who are a part of your experience at school. I think one of the things that really stands out for me in that context, in terms of academic background and education, my mother is an educator. She was and still is a teacher's aide, a paraprofessional at the elementary school in the neighboring county of Jasper. And she really focused in on education for myself and my younger sister very early. And we like to say we were in school, but we were also homeschooled. So we were in school twice. And didn't really have summer breaks away from an academic environment, because she had access to materials and workbooks and things that we would be moving into in the next school year because of her profession. And so, so I think that we were very focused on academics and focused on school. It was a very family-oriented environment, and very, very supportive.
So you're surrounded by tons of family, but it's a small. I'm thinking like it's rural. It's small, right? Yes. Most of your classmates you're related to?
Not quite.
Okay.
But I did go to school with a lot of cousins.
Yeah.
But yeah, our town, Newton, Texas, at the time I was in high school, had about 3,000, a population of 3,000, and my graduating class was 88 people.
Wow. Okay. So was it, is Newton or Holly Springs, are these very diverse places? They're
I would say that it's more diverse now than it was, but it was very concretely black and white when I was very young. And I think the really interesting thing for me, I remember my mother had bought a Fisher-Price record player, and there was a Disney album, and on the front of the album cover was a world with children from different countries all around the sort of encircling the globe. And the song was "It's a Small World." And I would look at the album cover. I must have been 4 or 5 years old. Look at the album cover and play the song over and over and over. Because even within that environment, I think I was very drawn to cultural diversity. And I wanted to travel and to be exposed to cultural differences. And so when I got the opportunity to go to Los Angeles for graduate school, it was maybe a culmination of that desire to be exposed to cultural differences and to be in an environment that was very, very diverse. And I think subsequently traveling to different countries, I taught for a couple of months in South Africa. I visited Kenya, and I went to Ghana with the Association of Black Psychologists in 2000. So being able to, I think, be exposed to different cultures and to learn about different cultures and to share my passion about cultural diversity with students has been something, it's been a deeply held core value for, I think, a very, very long time.
What do you tell students who, if a student was to ask you, and I'm about to put you on the spot, so feel free to decline, but if a student was to ask you, hey, why is this cultural diversity thing such a big deal? Why are you so passionate about it? Why should I be interested in it? What kind of answer would you give to a student?
I think that my pat answer is always sort of referring students back to the APA Multicultural guidelines and helping students understand that for the profession of psychology, we have ethical standards and guidelines for appropriate service delivery to people from diverse groups. And then just from a personal level, I think that developing one skill set around flexibility and being able to interact with a variety of groups, whether it's, language development or cultural development or working with other types of diverse communities. I want to mention transgender folks and LGBTQ folks, and developing competencies or skills in that area really broadens a person's skill set. So I try to encourage students to think of it as the right thing to do and the ethical thing to do. But also it is a skill set that can be life-wide rather than only for your career path. This is a skill set that you can use in other areas as well.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, now that you're describing it that way, I think about your student who was afraid that they were going to, make the class difficult, and you asked them to do a better job, maybe or to build the skill set of listening, which will serve that student really well in the future. So anyway, so when you were growing up, your mother obviously had a huge effect on you, and I'm going to guess that you and your sister were pretty good academically because of that. Did that work?
Yes.
So, and did your parents go to college?
My mother attended some college, and my father did not attend college. He worked at a local lumber factory. I think one of the larger industries in Southeast Texas is lumber. And that was his profession throughout his life.
And so this is one of Eric, my podcast partner's favorite questions, which is when it came time, were you supposed to go to college, or was it your choice?
Oh, yeah. There was not a choice.
Yeah.
We were going to college. And I think that I'm really grateful. I should say this about my father. He retired from working at the lumber plant. He worked for 17 years on the night shift. So he would work overnight. And before we were in school, sort of watch the children during the day. And my mother would work during the day. And then he would go to work and she would be home and she would be there for us. So my parents made a tremendous amount of sacrifice as a team and as a partnership so that they could provide their children with opportunities. And so, as you say, when it came time for applying to colleges and graduating from high school, it really was not a choice. It was, the only choice was, where are you going?
Yeah. Yeah. And how did that choice get made? Did you apply at a bunch of places? And were high school teachers or advisors at all involved in that for you?
Sure. Yes. So my high school principal at the time was a graduate of Baylor University. And I believe her husband had also attended Baylor Law School at some point. But they were big Baylor fans and alumni and, held a really close attachment to Baylor. So I applied to Baylor, Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas, and a couple of other places, maybe not in Texas, and those were discouraged. And so I was accepted to both SFA and Baylor offered me an academic scholarship. And so, of course, that was where I decided to go, both in terms of having people at my high school who had been graduates of Baylor, and also because my, financially, I had more financial aid to go there.
How far is Baylor from Holly Springs?
About 4 hours.
Okay. So,
driving.
Yeah. But Texas is big. You guys are used to driving those long distances, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I had a lot of friends who were also from Southeast Texas. And so we would travel together back and forth from Baylor to, one person was from one small town, another person was from another small town. So we would sort of carpool and drop each other off as we went home to visit our family. So it was great.
Yeah, I bet it was. Did you study psychology straight away?
Yes, I actually thought that I wanted in undergrad. I went to Baylor thinking I wanted to be a pediatrician. And I attended my first chemistry course. I was pre-med psychology major. And I attended my first chemistry course, and I think I withdrew from it with a D average, before the withdrawal deadline.
Yeah.
And decided, okay, so I don't think medicine is my path. And it's funny because my best friend has a PhD in chemistry, and she and I were in the same class, and she aced the class and subsequently went into a STEM field and has done very well. And I think I knew at that moment that, it wasn't going to be.
I have the same story, except it was a microeconomics course. And I looked around and I thought, I'm good at math. What is going on here? And I'm like, oh, it's a different skill set and I don't get it. So
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So at that point, you doubled down on psychology?
I doubled down on psychology. I think I knew at that point that I wanted to go into clinical psychology. It had always been something I was interested in. So I knew that I wanted to go into clinical psychology. I didn't have an opportunity to explore multicultural psychology very much in my undergraduate program. But again, as I said, once I went to graduate school, I had more exposure in that area. And so that really sort of piqued my interest and developed my path in that area.
Yeah. So you graduate from Baylor, and then how do you make that decision to go to LA? I'm sure there was graduate programs closer to home, make your family happy.
Right. At that time, I really wanted to leave and explore and see the world and have other experiences and be exposed to other cultures. And Los Angeles just seemed like the right place to do that.
Yeah. What was it like to move to LA and have when you moved there, was it just like you were wide-eyed and everything was great and look at all these cultures that I get to learn from? Or was it scary to go there? Yeah, because you hadn't left Texas really before that, right?
Right,
yeah.
Right. Not much at all. It was scary. But it was also exciting. Again, I think I was seeking out experiences, and I wanted to explore and have exposure to different ways of thinking and being in the world. And I think I also, at that time, as I guess a 23-year-old, wanted to do some self-exploration also. I think when you think about some of the developmental theories around identity, and you can sort of get to this place of identity foreclosure. And I think I wanted to move beyond that to really understand what my beliefs were, what were my personal values. Again, I wanted to learn about different cultures and be exposed to differences. And it was a wonderful time to do that, just in terms of the California School and the Multicultural Community Psychology program. And within the context of Los Angeles, which has wonderful cultural diversity, it was a really important, I think, developmental opportunity for me. Mm-hmm. And I did move back to Texas shortly after graduating from graduate school. My father had become ill, and I wanted to be closer to home, and I moved to Dallas at that time.
Okay. And what was your first job out of graduate school?
My first job was at what was then Argosy University PsyD Clinical Psychology program in Dallas. And after that, moved to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology as a faculty member. And that's been my career.
So when you first started graduate school, you thought you were going to be a clinician. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at what point did that shift over to, no, I think I want to teach?
So when I moved back to Dallas, I started teaching right away. And I think it was about 6 years in, I started a private practice. So for a long time, I taught as a core departmental faculty and also saw clients. And I think that the common thread for me has been the multicultural and diversity piece, because in my clinical practice, the majority of my clients were people from marginalized communities, people who were seeking out a clinician who would be responsive to their particular form of representation and diversity. And I think having an understanding of intersectionality and understanding a variety of beliefs and values, particularly I think in Texas, which has a tendency to be more conservative, people were really excited about having an opportunity to have a therapist who would be open to those types of characteristics and to really sort of walk through some of those things. And so, again, for a very long time, I was both seeing clients as well as teaching. And then I had a kiddo and I let go of the practice for a while, and very recently started back doing telehealth because of the COVID situation. Yeah.
Yeah. What's that been like for you to jump back in? Because how many years were you away from practicing?
I was away from practicing for about 4 years.
Oh, that's not too long. You probably still had all the chops to do that well, but what about telehealth? Because you'd always been in the room with clients before that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What's that like?
I was saying to someone earlier that it is different. Being in a room with someone, I think doing supportive therapy or the sort of comforting aspects of therapy, it's easier to do in person with the sort of nonverbal communication and listening skills. It's just a lot easier in person. And I find that right now doing telehealth practice, I'm much more concrete, and I give clients homework at the end of the session so that we can have a structure and have something to carry them throughout the week. I think that in terms of telehealth, I find myself more structured and concrete, and as opposed to being in person and being a little more relaxed and warm and supportive.
Yeah. I see. I was trained as a therapist, and I don't practice anymore, but I do see a therapist really regularly, and I have found telehealth to be just fine. It's actually, I think I was shocked at how well it works and how normal it can be. So, we were forced to try a lot of new things over this last year that we just would never have tried probably. So, so you eventually moved to the Chicago school, and you've been there for how long? 10 years now, did you say?
I've been with the Chicago school, I think it'll be 7 or 8 years in August.
Okay. And then at what point do you get involved or learn about STP? Because I know that's where you've served a lot nationally. So how did that come about?
Yes. So I attended the Best Practices Conference in Atlanta for the teaching of diversity many, many years ago. And I can't remember the year. I know that I was still a faculty member at Argosy, Dallas when I attended. And that really was my first exposure to STP. There was a book that was published. Laredo Prieto published a number of the presentations from the conference. And so I wrote a couple of chapters for his book and got involved at that point with the diversity committee. Lynn Littleford was also involved with STP at the time and was very supportive and encouraging for me to get more involved. So I spent a number of years with the diversity committee.
Just for those who don't know what best practices was, it's now the annual conference on teaching, but it was best practices. I never went to a best practices conference, so you predate me with STP. But the other thing that I want to just make sense of, and you can tell me if I'm right, is that they would often choose a theme for the conference, and so the one you went to was on diversity. That's probably what drew you in, right? Yes.
I attended because I was teaching diversity.
Right. Okay.
And I both wanted to share my experiences, to meet other faculty who were teaching similar content. And yes, so that was the big draw for me.
Do you know how you learned of it? Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay.
Probably on some sort of APA listserv or something.
Sure.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry to cut you off. So you attend that conference and then you get involved on, did you say a task force? No, it was
the diversity committee.
The diversity committee. Yeah. So you got involved pretty quickly.
Right. So I served, I think, 2 terms with the diversity committee, which was about 6 years. And when the International Relations Committee was formed, I begged the VP of Diversity and International Relations at the time, who was Lynn Littleford, to let me be a part of this new International Relations committee, please, please, please. And she said yes. And so for maybe 2 or 3 years, I was the liaison between the two committees because I was connected with both of those committees. And
oh my gosh, that's like your perfect sweet spot, right? In between international relations and diversity. That's where you live, actually. So no wonder you wanted to be there. Okay.
Absolutely. And Susan Nolan was then, I think, at some point in that process, became the vice president for diversity and international relations. I worked with Susan as the chair then of the International Relations Committee. And Susan encouraged me to be nominated for the vice president for diversity and international relations. And that's how my current position came to be.
And you've been serving in that role for how long now?
The December of 2021 will be the end of my first term, and it's a 3-year term.
Yeah. Okay.
So 19
through 21-ish. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Some of those. Yeah. The term I'm on in my position with STP is also 3 years. Maybe that's the norm. Okay. So you just happen to be in this position with STP at this time in 2020 when these doors open, and we need people who know how to navigate that stuff, because I think what I have heard from faculty, whether it's through kind of Marianne Lloyd's project on Ask Psych sessions and the stuff we've done around equity and diversity there, but also just on my local campus, what I've heard is that most of us do not feel equipped. Most of us did not know what to do. We don't know how to affect, most of us don't know how to affect systemic change at our institutions. It's not what we were trained in. And so we've already covered kind of that you were ready to do this, but this eventually turns into a pretty meaningful statement by STP. But can you just tell us, how did we get from, the murder of George Floyd and everything that came along with that, and then eventually to the STP statement on addressing systematic racism? What happened? For those of us who are in STP, we're not on the executive committee. We don't understand how that decision was made. Can you just walk us through that?
Sure. So I want to say first that I would love to talk a little bit more about this idea of faculty not having competency in making structural change or affecting systemic sorts of issues within their departments and institutions. So that's something I need to talk about before.
Yeah. Sure.
Finish.
No, let's chat.
But I can talk about the STP statement. So during that time, as you know, many corporations and organizations and other APA divisions were making statements about systemic racism specifically during that time, because this is the issue, again, that activists had clarified for us, that this is a systemic issue. We need to focus on structural inequities and structural change. And again, many organizations and corporations made their statements, some more meaningful than others. And the executive committee of STP had a conversation at the time about whether or not we wanted to also make a statement. I believe that our Graduate Student Teaching Association made a very strong statement even before the executive committee. And so we decided we need to address this. We need to say something. And so a small task force of about 4, I think, members of the executive committee got together. We put together a statement, and before distributing it to our other EC members or to our STP membership, wanted someone else to take a look at it. Is this good enough? What do you think about this statement? And so we sent it to some members of our diversity committee. I think 3 members of our diversity committee, including our chair of our diversity committee, Tacita Tormala. And they said, this is not up to snuff. You need to start over at the drawing board. This is unacceptable. And we started over. And it was such a wonderful experience of listening and having the cultural humility, I think, to be taught and to see from another's perspective, and to understand that as an organization, you need to go the extra step. Instead of being performative or sort of making this surface level type of statement, we need to really look at STP and do some organizational assessment and identify. One of the pieces of feedback from one of the members who reviewed the original statement was, what are STP's values around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Identify those, and then identify ways that you will address those values. And then we looked at some other literature from outside of psychology, even at, what works best in a statement, what do we need to say in a statement? And one of the recommendations was acknowledging your organization's own involvement in systemic inequities and even offering an apology based on some of those things. And so we took all of this to heart, and we started over, and we rewrote the statement, resubmitted it to representatives from the diversity committee, and they thought it was great. They had some additional feedback for us. And after that, I think we sent it to division services at APA, who were very impressed with the statement also. I think that because we had gone through and really did the work to take a look at what is it that we really want to say? What is it that we really need to say in this moment to our membership? Keith Cook at APA described our statement as strong and compelling, and also as potentially a model for other divisions or other APA services in responding to these types of challenges. And so that's how our statement on addressing systemic racism in STP came to be. And we currently have a presidential task force that is looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across the organization, and particularly looking at the statement and some of the initiatives that we want to incorporate and integrate into the organization moving forward. So one example of that is the creation of special interest groups within STP that are developed by the membership and not by leadership. Another area I think that we are looking at is doing some organizational self-assessment. So each of the VP areas for STP will be looking at their particular area to see, what are some of the gaps and needs in and around diversity, equity, inclusion for their area.
I'm so glad that that work is going on. One of my questions before this, and I think I did know that I'd forgotten that task force was happening right now. But I think one of my questions at the beginning of our conversation was going to be, so this statement was put out there, but how do you make sure that it's not just a statement, but that it's got, it's got some traction? And I think this is a really nice next step. It sounds like to put this into practice, really is that how you see the task force?
I do, and I should say that we had an ongoing task force in 2020 that was also looking at some of these issues, and their group actually initially recommended the creation of the special interest groups, and the current task force will be developing the process by which those special interest groups are created. And yes, I believe that this current presidential task force is being led by a wonderful faculty member, Arlen Garcia, who is relatively new to STP, but not to diversity, equity, inclusion, or the teaching of psychology. And their task force is really developing accountability practices. How do we as an organization stay on top of these things? How do we ensure that leadership is being accountable to some of the directives and the promises that the organization has made around some of these issues?
Oh, that's so cool. Now, I saw your face light up about 10 minutes ago when I talked about classroom practices and affecting kind of systems from within the classrooms or within curriculum. So, just my own process. I think as soon as things got really heated up, I saw I think Psych Sessions put out an online teaching kind of season immediately, and we turned that around within like a couple weeks because we felt like educators were looking, who had never been taught online before, were looking for resources for that. And then we started talking to people who were further down the path of equity and diversity, like yourself. And we started talking to others who could help us navigate it. So what do you have to say about teachers kind of working on kind of diversity issues in the classroom? I'll let you run with it.
Right. So I think what I want to say is there is a lot of literature about working on diversity issues in the classroom. And I think that at this time, it's important for faculty members to have and develop skills in what is known as structural competencies. So how a structural competency or building a structural competency would mean developing skills to affect change in systems and to confront structural inequities. So if I am a teacher of psychology in an institution that has a great deal of issues in structural racism, I am teaching diversity, I am engaging in inclusive practices in my classroom, I might even teach about global citizenship in my classroom. What that does not do is support students who walk out of our classroom and deal with a system that is set up for them to not be successful. And I think that as faculty members, it's our responsibility to begin to develop competencies in the areas where we are supporting and advocating for students outside the classroom. So we are holding our institutions accountable. We are recommending and suggesting curriculum changes and departmental changes that address structural and systemic inequities that impact our students. And I think also addressing these issues for fellow faculty members. There's a bit of research that came out recently that talked about systemic racism in psychological science, for instance, or a number of studies that show instructors of color are often rated less competent than white instructors. So we, as faculty, I think, must be accountable to not only best practices in teaching, but additionally developing competencies to be effective in creating structural and systemic change.
I just am kind of learning this, what you're saying right now. And I think for folks who are like, so, okay, what does this look like practically? You bring up research. I think there is research on course instructor evaluations that is out there. And when it's so inequitable from a gender and from a gender perspective, from like a racial perspective, that we have to ask our institutions how and why they are using these kinds of things. And it is nice to be able to have research. It's a fair question because it's not my opinion. There are people who have studied these things and this exists. Now,
Right.
I just wonder, are you aware of any kind of a web page where these studies exist, where faculty could go to this web page and say, I want to educate myself about the systemic inequities of various things, that just so I can be more informed when I do go to those faculty meetings or whatever. Are you aware of anything like that?
I am not, unfortunately, and that would be a wonderful resource. There were some resources, I think. There was a Google Doc that went around over the summer that had a list of, and I believe it's on the STP Facebook group, but it was a list of readings and research from authors who were BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color authors. I think there were a number of other resources that talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. But in terms of, having a website or a repository of resources specifically for faculty members who want to look at some of these areas, that does not currently exist. And I think that is certainly a need. And I believe that our diversity committee has some initiatives in mind to provide resources for faculty in some of these areas, and also in terms of inclusive pedagogies in the classroom. So hopefully we will have access to some of those resources soon. But no, sort of right offhand, I don't know of a resource like that. I will say, though, that there's some excellent research coming out of sociology around these issues. There's a sociologist, Victor Ray, who has written about a theory of racialized organizations. He also wrote for the Harvard Business Review an article entitled "Why Are Organizations So White?" that talks about how organizations are not colorblind. We like to pretend that our organizations are colorblind, but they are not. There are, structural racial inequities in organizations that need to be addressed. And so I think that area of research and literature is a good place to start in terms of developing an understanding of structural and organizational inequities.
Well, thanks for that. I definitely want to check out that article. So I appreciate you sharing it. Kelley, it has been so nice to have you on, and I know we've gone past time. I do appreciate your time, and so I hope that I could see you face to face at some point, maybe October. Who knows, right? But
oh, I know. I hope so. I really hope so.
Well, yeah, well, we'll look forward to that. We'll cross our fingers. For now, I wish you all the best in everything that you're doing. And thank you so much for the work you're doing on behalf of STP and our future as an organization. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Garth. This was great. I had a great time with you.
Yeah, me too. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.